Hi, this is lesson 4.4, America on the World Stage. This is a very large topic, and remember, we are covering 48 years of history, so we're going to be covering it all throughout the time period. So we're going to be going in chronological order. Let's do this. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how and why American foreign policy developed and expanded over time. So pretty simple. Let's get right to it because there is a lot. This is all about how America is wanting to seek a global presence and how we have to protect our own country. So let's start talking about foreign policy. To rewind, if you remember, George Washington during his farewell address really kind of warned the United States not to get involved in political affairs of foreign nations. This practice is called isolationism. This is a super important concept, and because George Washington said it, it really took root in the American mind. However, despite Washington's warning, we do become involved in a number of military conflicts as an independent nation. So let's rewind again. During the presidency of John Adams, we are engaged in what is called quasi-war with France. They were attacking our shipping because France and England were at war. Adams worked very hard to keep us neutral. However, we still had to get involved to some extent. So when the time period 4 picks up in the year 1800, Thomas Jefferson is president. And if you remember, Thomas Jefferson opposed the idea of the Federalist creation of a naval force during the quasi-war. He was against having a large military presence, against a navy. But during Jefferson's presidency, we need that Navy because we are engaged in a 15-year-long conflict called the Barbary War. It's in quotes because it really wasn't a war. Congress never declared war, but it is a war with pirates. The Barbary Coast is the shores of North Africa, Tripoli, Algeria, all of those countries, and they were attacking American shipping. So we were paying tribute. We were paying bribes to these pirates under the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. And during Jefferson's administration, we actually have to engage with the Barbary pirates to protect our shipping. So moving on to the president after Thomas Jefferson, we have James Madison. And under the presidency of James Madison, we actually do declare war. We declare war on Great Britain. This is called the War of 1812. It's pretty easy to remember when this one happens. And it's our first military conflict since the Revolutionary War. So it's important to point out that we weren't necessarily 100% prepared. The reasons why it began, the causes of the attack. They were attacking our shipping. That was pretty huge. And they were giving aid, if you remember, to the Native Americans, arms, etc., to the Native Americans in the Northwest Territories. So even though they were attacking our shipping, impressing our sailors, arming, we were hesitant. And finally, we declared war, in part because there are a group of young congressmen who live in the western states, such as Tennessee and Kentucky. These young congressmen are known as the war hawks. They were pushing for war because they felt we'd use this to expand our influence in the West by completely getting rid of the British. So they use their influence in Congress, and they want war at any cost. The war divides the nation. The South and the West really want the war. The Northeast, who needs the shipping to not be disrupted, who is closer to the British, do not want the war. So in terms of the war, there are several notable events. One notable event is the British burned down public buildings, such as the White House, when they occupy Washington, D.C. They force Madison and Congress to flee the city. Another significant event is the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. We win the Battle of Baltimore, which inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, which would later be adapted to our national anthem. And the last notable event is the Battle of New Orleans. It's a man who was from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, won a surprise victory over the British using an alliance of free Western militiamen, enslaved Black people, free Black soldiers, Native Americans, and once again, pirates. So it was a huge victory. It promoted Andrew Jackson into the ranks of becoming a national hero. Everybody knew his name. Unfortunately, the peace treaty, which returned everything to how it was before the war, had already been signed by the time the Battle of New Orleans occurred. That's how long it took for communication. So even though it was a great battle, it didn't have any other real influence on the war itself. So moving on to the impact of the war. After the war, we experience a heightened sense of nationalism. We don't lose against the British. We are in our prime. We are united as Americans. We held our own against the British. Another impact is that the Federalist Party, who was predominant in New England, they opposed the war. They fell into disgrace because they didn't want the war, and the war becomes a good thing. This leads Republican newspapers to begin to declare that America is in an era of good feelings, because with the demise of the Federalist Party, there will be only one political party left, thus leading to this idea of good feelings. And finally, moving on, we see Andrew Jackson being promoted to this idea of a national hero. He joins the echelon of heroes on par with George Washington, and he becomes part of this second generation of national leaders. So the last item of this key concept is Jackson's invasion of Florida. After a series of attacks by native nations coming out of Florida onto Western lands, Andrew Jackson leads a militia to invade and occupy Spanish Florida without their consent, Congress or James Monroe's consent. However, because of Jackson's occupation, it does allow the Spanish to want to be willing to let go of Florida, and we are able to buy it, thus expanding into more Western lands. So even though he did it without congressional or presidential approval, it once again proved to be a victory because we were able to gain Florida. Next key concept we continue on. This is about how we seek influence in the world and this global stage. First, we seek the idea of moving Native Americans and what to do with them. Under President Thomas Jefferson, he seeks to assimilate them. He seeks to want to bring them into the folds. And he thinks that a change from trading and hunting and gathering to self-sufficient farming will be the best for them. And this doesn't work out so well for them because if you remember, even those that were civilized were in the way. When the white Southern planters needed access to millions of acres that was protected, another Southern leader, John C. Calhoun, introduces this idea of removal, where Native people would settle, and they'd settle west of the Mississippi River. The land that they would be given would be called Indian Territory. It's now Oklahoma. And they would have to give up their lands inside the eastern states. Some voluntarily moved to the Indian Territory, but others, such as the Cherokee in Georgia, were forced to leave, thus leading to what we know today as the Trail of Tears. Another idea involving struggle in the West is the idea of Texas. The Texans and Americans begin to move into Texas with the promise of free land. Mexico willingly invited American settlers into Tejas, and many wanted to go because they desired, the lack of structure. Texas was part of Mexico, and Mexico wanted whites to come because they needed the money for taxations. However, when the white settlers begin to outnumber the Mexican people, Mexico increases the taxation and they ban slavery. This is not going to fly. The Texans revolt. The American Texans, I should say, revolt. They do suffer an early defeat at the celebrated Alamo. It was a defeat, and Texas leaders Stephen Austin and Sam Houston eventually lead their troops to victory. However, once they declare their independence from Mexico, the Republic of Texas actually petitions Congress for statehood. Congress denies statehood, fear of war with Mexico, and northern states did not want more southern states to have slavery. It would upset the balance. So the annexation of Texas is put on hold, and Texas remains the Lone Star Republic, only state to have been a independent nation first. The final way in which we try to assert ourselves, we thus remove Native Americans. They're a foreign power. We, the Texans, went to war with Mexico in the Texas Revolution. And last, and certainly not least, is this item known as the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to rewind a bit. Simon Bolivar, inspired by the American Revolution, led a series of revolutions against Spanish colonization in Latin America, including Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. The United States can now trade with these nations now that Spain is gone. And the United States wanted to ensure that no other European nation would try to recolonize the newly independent territories. We wanted to be able to trade with those countries without a European country involved. So, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, John Adams, drafted a policy for President James Monroe. It was called the Monroe Doctrine, which unilaterally, this means it was one-sided without the agreement of the other European nations. They declared all of America part of American protection in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine forbids European powers from creating any new colonies or recolonizing independent nations in the entire Western Hemisphere. It also declared that the United States would stay out of European affairs. So it draws a clear line of demarcation. The Western Hemisphere is ours. It's the United States of America to protect, and you stay out. And we also promise to stay out. This being said, despite this bold move onto the world stage, we have little ability as a nation to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And the idea that we did this to protect ourselves, knowing that we had no ability to enforce it, demonstrates a little bit of boldness for this young nation. So in conclusion, I hope that you are able to explain how and why American foreign policy developed and expanded from 1800 to 1848.